Welcome to our series of educational videos on immigration. Today, we will discuss asylum seekers. We'll discuss the definition of asylum seeker, how they are processed into the US usually, what happens after they arrive. An asylum seeker is a person who is seeking protection from persecution in another country. So one of the differences between an asylum seeker and a refugee is that they are still seeking that protection and they haven't been legally recognized as a refugee. Next slide, please. Another key difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee is that the asylum seeker has to be at our border or in the US. They cannot be processed in a third country like a refugee at this time. A bulk of the immigrants at our southern border fall into this category of asylum seekers. And I would like to stress that one way of seeking asylum is if you cross the border at any point, including ports of entry. And it is clear that there is no restriction that one has to come through a port of entry. It can be any place in the border. Section 208 of the US Immigration and Nationality Act is very clear. It says anyone who arrives in the United States, whether or not at a designated port of arrival, is eligible to apply for asylum. Next slide, please. As I said before, you can apply for asylum if you're already in the country. You could have come on a different visa, you could have been allowed into the country legally, and you will have passports and documents, and suddenly things change inside your home country, and therefore you would need to apply for asylum. This is called the affirmative process. Next slide, please. When you arrive at the border or between points of entry and ask for asylum, that is called the defensive process. And yes, the US does have a process for asylum seekers who'd come across the border, especially the southern border, or between points of entry. Unfortunately, it is not being followed right now at our southern border, but we shall discuss that in the next slide. So usually what the defensive process should look like is when an individual crosses the border or at the port of entry, approaches a government agent to express fear of return. They're usually then, once they express that fear, they're usually held in Customs and Border Protection custody, their security is checked, then they will be transferred to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And there, while in detention, they are given a credible fear interview, which is to determine if there is a significant possibility of fear. They do not adjudicate the whole case. It's just to determine if there's a possibility of it, and it's usually done by an asylum officer. Once that fear has been established, they will get a notice to appear before a judge, where the individual then can pursue his or her asylum claim outside of detention, hopefully. If one fails the credible fear interview, then the individual is put in deportation proceedings and will most likely be deported. That is the usual way this works. Next slide, please. More than 80% of those who claim to have fear pass their credible fear interview. Over 90% of asylum seekers who are released and asked to appear before a judge do so, and almost 100% appear if they have a lawyer. So this idea that there are several asylum seekers or immigrants who do not show up for their court cases and therefore must be detained, that is not correct. The numbers and the statistics do not show us that is correct. Next slide, please. Once asylum seekers are pursuing their asylum application, they only have generally two rights in the US. They have the right to remain in the US and they can apply for a work permit. They get no other benefits or support from the US government until their asylum application is processed and they say that they have been given asylum. This entire process can take up to 6 years or more. And in this time, the only benefit that an asylum seeker will have is that he or she can work in the country. This is how much asylum seekers contribute to the United States. Next slide, please. And asylum seekers should not be criminalized for seeking safety. We do have a process. It should be followed. Maybe we can do it better, but we do know that there is a process. I would like to reiterate that this process is not working right now in July of 2021 because of the Title 42 order. I will talk more about this order in our next video. Thank you for listening. Please get involved with Network and follow us on www.networklobby.org.